you look through all of Stephen Chow's films throughout his career, I think the Chinese Odyssey films are ones which come up as absolute favourites for so many people, whether they're specifically a fan of his Molei comedy, whether they're a fan of like his work post Shaolin Soccer. I think the Chinese Odyssey films really speak to everyone. They're beloved favourites in Hong Kong, China, for fans in the West. And I think for a lot of them, I mean, for me, they were some of the first Stephen Chow films I actually saw. And, you know, they work differently in different ways for different people, I think. Because if you look at them as an adaptation of Journey to the West, and I've never read the original text for it itself, but they're very, very loose adaptations, and they're better to call them revisionings, I think, in that sort of Stephen Chow, sort of mid-90s Hong Kong kind of way, in that they take his comedy style, they take the character as a very basic framework from the literature, and they sort of mix it all together into these two crazy films with like comedy, time travel, monsters, makeup, kung fu, and pretty much everything else. So they're these fantastic, complete mixture of different styles. And for me as well, they were the first films where Stephen Chow was taking these steps towards that sort of modern Stephen Chow, the post-handover Stephen Chow, Shaolin Soccer, Kung Fu Hustle, The Mermaid. The bigger budget films, which still dealt with some themes of Buddhism, which still connected into some of the, if not Chinese literature, then at least Chinese sort of culture, some of the ancient traditions or ancient beliefs. So before these films, I think we were seeing quite a mixture of his stuff. I think '94 was probably the year when he really started coming into his own. It's when he started writing and directing with From Beijing with Love. And before that, you know, he was gradually getting more and more in control of his films. But I think the Chinese Odyssey ones, for me, are the ones which really mark kind of a step towards what I associate with him from his bigger, more recent hits.
鬼啊！我睇下，
咁靚仔你嗌有鬼，懶泥扶唔上壁。
And they're very interesting films in a lot of different ways, because for me, when I watch them again now, I mean, I still don't understand what's going on most of the time in them, to be fair. But I think there's, on the one hand, you can say that's, oh, we don't understand it, we can't follow it. On the other hand, you can still make films like these, which are incredibly entertaining. They're still very, very engaging, and they're actually quite moving. I mean, at the end of the day, these films do still speak to the actual Buddhist teachings, which were at the heart of Journey to the West, about the sense of self, about giving yourself up, and about love in there as well. And it still blows my mind that I'm saying this about these incredibly wacky, crazy films with like Spider-Womans and all the sort of lowbrow jokes which are in the films. So they're a fantastic combination of all these different elements, and I think that's why they were so popular now. And if we look back at when they actually came out in 1995, they didn't make as much money as some of his other films. I think the first one made 25 million, the second one made 20 million, and they came out very close to each other. Whereas if you look back at 92, you know, he had, out of the top 10 films that year, he had the top 5. The first one, Justice My Foot, coming in at 50 million, and all the other ones he was in were making like 35 to 45 million. So on the one hand, there's kind of a step down in terms of box office, but then you also have to think about where the Hong Kong industry was in 1995, whereas it wasn't in as rude a health as it had been a few years ago, for many different reasons, like the spread of piracy. This was only 2 years before the handover, with all the uncertainty that actually brought, and as well, like post 93, films like Jurassic Park and Hollywood had really been like dominating at the Hong Kong box office and displacing a lot of films as well. So on the one hand, if you actually just look at the box office figures, they don't seem like as big a hit. But I can guarantee, and I've screened these films myself at my festival, and they are incredibly popular. That people love these films. People still quote the line about 1,000 years.
如果個天可以俾個機會我翻轉頭嘅話，我會同個女仔講我愛佢。如果係都要喺呢份愛加上一個期限，我希望係1萬年。
These films actually had a huge cultural impact, as well as their box office. And they were incredibly popular in mainland China, as well as in Hong Kong. And that's a very interesting thing about Stephen Chow, I think, as well, is I think he was, even from quite early on, he was one of the filmmakers, one of the actors, one of the creatives, even before he was directing. There's so much about his work which was speaking to the mainland audience as well as to the Hong Kong audience. And it's not something you would necessarily assume, because coming to his films, especially his early ones, as a Western, as an international audience as well, that we miss so much from the subtitles in Cantonese. And of course, the Cantonese and Mandarin are so different together, but so many of his films were actually getting properly rewritten into Mandarin and then re-recorded. They weren't just getting a cheap dub. So Stephen Chow fans in the mainland were actually getting proper Stephen Chow films as well, which they could enjoy. So they were getting a different interpretation of his comedy, but one which he was still involved in the actual rewriting of. So there's so much about these films of his from the early days as well. You can really chart his career, like the growth of his comedy, shall we say. And I think the Chinese Odyssey films are his first kind of big fantasy blockbuster films, kind of in that respect. And we'd seen hints of this coming in things like The Mad Monk, for example. There's a few of the other films which still deal with literature in a sort of irreverent way, but which still at their heart deal with some of these slightly Buddhist themes. And again, I'm kind of making them sound like more serious films than they actually are, but I think that's why they're so popular, is because they work on so many levels. They're not films which preach or espouse values in that respect, but they deal with these things and themes, and in a very funny way, in a very accessible way, in a very entertaining way as well. And you can see that in the fact that they're popular for international audiences and Western audiences as well. For people who wouldn't know about Journey to the West, they might have seen Monkey, for example. They might have seen some of the other series or some of the many, many other films, but probably wouldn't actually know about who these characters are, the Longevity Monk, the Monkey King, all the many, many, many demons who are in the film. So I just find it fascinating that you can have these films which on the surface level are incredibly chaotic, and they are. And the plot doesn't really make too much sense. Even the jump between the two films, you have to watch them back to back. If you even went a month between them, you would forget. You wouldn't have a clue what was going on. I certainly wouldn't. But there's something about these films which still really speaks to people when they came out, and which speaks to people now as well.
啱睇嘛？
係你隻馬騮精，
馬騮精，
孫悟空咯，
孫悟空，
你變咗人樣就得啦。
人樣？
睇嚟我唔用三味白骨火，你都唔會應噶啦。
哇！使唔使啊？又燒！
Because Stephen Chow slowed down considerably, I would say even before the handover, he wasn't making quite as much, and then post handover, he's moved away from acting. You know, he's had a few huge hits. We had Shaolin Soccer, Kung Fu Hustle, The Mermaid, all of which increasingly made more and more money, not just in Hong Kong, but in mainland China and internationally as well. But I think if we look back to the Chinese Odyssey films, that's where we can see the seeds of these films, I think, really coming in. In the way he would actually combine this Malay-Tao comedy with something very, very specific, something very, very Cantonese, language-wise, culture-wise, in terms of its pop culture references, all the way through the sense of anarchy. He was really adapting that in actually quite a clever way. I know he didn't direct the Chinese Odyssey films. He was working with Jeff Lau, who made so many different Chinese Odyssey films himself throughout his career. Even then, you can see these films very much as Stephen Chow films, from a creative point of view, from a philosophical point of view. And I think that's what we really see coming out in them.
嗱，睇到啦嘛？睇到啦？啊？清楚冇？
哼！呃我，你個根本就。
I think for audiences in the West now, if you come to the Chinese Odyssey films, there are so many things about them to like, and not just in the fact they're very entertaining films, they're very funny films. And to be honest, you might not understand them when you actually watch them, but from a cultural point of view, not in terms of getting a realistic picture of what Journey to the West is about. I mean, good luck with that from these films. But these are such a perfect summary of where Stephen Chow was at this time in his career, where Hong Kong cinema was at this time, culturally, financially, in terms of trying to compete with some of the Hollywood films which are coming these way. I mean, adapting Journey to the West, one of the great classics of Chinese literature, these films were trying their best to be like blockbusters in that sense. I mean, it's not so much about directly competing with Hollywood, but they were pitching for a Hong Kong and mainland audience. They were pitching for a Pan-Asian audience, these films. They were not aimed at a Western audience, but these were kind of a step up during a very difficult time for Hong Kong cinema. So they're important films, but they're also incredibly entertaining films. And I think even if you're not familiar with Stephen Chow's Malay-Tao comedy, his Cantonese comedy style, the fantasy aspects of them work so well. And even if you just take them as like a weird, crazy, anarchic selection of fantasy set pieces, and it's incredibly entertaining. And his charisma shines through in them. I think the different characters, even if we don't really understand how they connect, fantastic performances by all the cast. And I think one of the other reasons they actually hold up well as the same as like quite a few of his films do. They've got surprisingly strong female characters in the films as well. And I'm not looking at these films with modern eyes back there. No, I'm not accusing them of feminism or anything. But the fact is, so many Hong Kong films of the early 90s to the mid 90s they're very sexist. They deal with a lot of, the female characters don't get a good ride of things. They're usually only there for kind of one reason. Whereas Stephen Chow, to a larger extent, works best when he has strong female leads beside him, not just for romance, but for banter, for backwards and forwards, and even sort of genuine bits of romance without the films being romantic in that sense. And you get that very much here as well, especially with Karen Mok in the film, who is fantastic in it. And they were together in real life at that time. So you can sense like a genuine chemistry between them, but it doesn't make these films unpalatable to look back at now in the way, realistically for some audiences. A lot of Hong Kong films, comedy films in particular, Wong Jing comedies, they're going to have scenes in them which are quite difficult to watch looking back. But these films age very, very well in that respect. As long as you can kind of go with the flow and just kind of experience them rather than trying to understand everything that's going on. I think that you can see why even now people who come to them for the first time, or frankly, I've seen these films so many times trying to figure out everything that's going on, even now knowing about Journey to the West, even having seen so many other adaptations. These are completely different films to the other ones, and I think they're better. They're a lot more fun, and they combine his mad energy at the same time with still a sense that they're at least saying something classical. There's some ties into literature, even if I don't really know what the tie-in exactly is.
我個名叫做齊天大聖，唔好再叫錯咯。
今日有你冇我，打死我快棍仔！
I mean, Stephen Chow has been a lot less active. I think we can say that certainly in the last 20 to 25 years, post-Handover in particular. We had Shaolin Soccer, Kung Fu Hustle, The Mermaid. Then his last acting appearance was in CJ7, the family-friendly film, which I'm not very keen on myself. But I think even that film, CJ7, sort of speaks to why he's not acting so much anymore. The market has changed so much. Audiences have changed so much. We're not really, either internationally or in Hong Kong or in China, there for that kind of Malay Tao sort of style anymore. The sort of random, sort of slightly raunchy, incredibly complex dialogue. So that kind of comedy is not popular anymore. And Stephen Chow has aged quite gracefully. I think, to be fair, he's not like a Jackie Chan who's still trying to do what he was doing back in the early 1990s. So I think you can see why he stepped back and he stepped more into directing. I think that's kind of the official line. He's moved behind the camera, but he hasn't done very much of that either. He's only made a handful of films, really. Certainly, if you think back in the early 1990s, he was making like 10 films a year. I mean, that was the kind of the time for Hong Kong cinema, but he's gone from being incredibly productive to just not being productive at all. And there's certainly a lot of different reasons you can read into it. As I've said, the changes in the market. We have heard that he's turned down attempts from Hollywood to woo him. We've heard that he's turned down a lot of big mainland blockbusters as well. So this is clearly his choice. This is clearly where he's going with his career. We keep hearing about The Mermaid 2 is coming. There's other things he might be working on, which never really seem to materialize. But the reality is that he is, in so many ways, a 1990s Hong Kong star. And trying to make a film against the new landscape of China and the Chinese film industry, not even so much as the censorship, but the process of making films is completely different. Do the younger audiences remember him? Is he still relevant for stuff? He doesn't seem interested really in finding out, to be honest. And I think he will make a few more films as director. I'd be surprised if he goes back and stars in anything. And some of his films, like The New King of Comedy, have not been particularly well received, where he has clearly tried to court the mainland market. And again, fair play. You can see why he's doing it. The mainland market is the Chinese market now. The Hong Kong box office, the Hong Kong market and the audience isn't there like it was in the 80s and 90s. So he has tried this. It hasn't massively worked out. I also don't think it fits with his creative process. He's another one who really likes to have creative control over what he's doing, everything from the casting to the design of it to the script. And I don't think he would be able to make films in the way he'd wanted to in the past, put it that way. And also he's had so much huge success. For a lot of people, like just Shaolin Soccer, Kung Fu Hustle in particular, are for some people what some 80s Jackie Chan films would have been for an early generation coming into Hong Kong cinema. So he's already, he's achieved so much He's had so much success. And if you can't really recreate it, it's arguably better not to just either go back to the well, but filter it through the new Chinese film industry system, because it wouldn't turn out the same. You couldn't make the films he made. And I don't mean that in some political censorship type of way. It's just those kind of jokes wouldn't fly anymore. They wouldn't come without being qualified with some patriotic speeches about the nature of China. Whereas his films, even if you look at beneath the foolishness of like Shaolin Soccer and Kung Fu Hustle, there are the same Buddhist undertones to those films, which you see in Chinese Odyssey and some of his other films as directors. So the kind of films he's made, I don't think he could make again. And I think he's not trying, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I think it would be, well, there wouldn't be much point in just trying to churn stuff out to fit the current audience. I don't think it would land internationally. I don't think it would land even with young Chinese audiences, to be honest. So it's a shame, but then we have a huge back catalogue of his work to go back to and enjoy, like the Chinese Odyssey films. So, and because he was making so many, especially in the early 1990s, and so many of them were not easy for international audiences to see at the time. So we still have a huge body of work for him, which we can explore. And I would prefer that than actually seeing some incredibly compromised, watered down, or even just him not being able to make the films he would have made back in those days. So yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons why we don't see much of Stephen Chow.
覺得好唔好玩啫？講嚟聽下。講啊！講啊！講啊！講啊！講啊！講啊！點解你硬係唔講嘢嘅啫？哎呀，救我啊！
I think for a lot of people now, realistically, they probably come to Stephen Chow through his slightly less insane films. Shaolin Soccer, Kung Fu Hustle, The Mermaid. So if you're going back and you're seeing a Chinese Odyssey, it's another really great sort of stepping stone to some of his really crazy films. Especially like A God of Cookery is probably my favorite Stephen Chow film, and Tricky Brains. And those two are very, very interesting comparisons, because God of Cookery is very, very much his film. Tricky Brains is more like a Wong Jing film, but with him in there and Andy Lau in there and all these other Stephen Chow regulars in there. So I would probably steer clear of some of the really, really dense Mo Lei Tao ones, or some of his more random ones, like some of the historical films he made in the early 1990s, where he was being bounced around so many kinds of different roles. They're still very fun, but I would come to those last. I would probably go God of Cookery next if I was going to give a suggestion where to go.